My name is Melinda Moore. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Eastern Kentucky University. And in that role, I'm a clinical suicidologist by training, which means I have some specialized training above and beyond my clinical psychology training in suicide assessment, intervention, and management. I got my PhD at Catholic University of America. There's a very famous psychologist there. His name is Dr. David Jobs. He developed something called the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality, which is one of the 3 empirically supported suicide-focused treatments available today. The others are cognitive therapy for suicide prevention and dialectical behavior therapy. And in my role as assistant professor, I train doctoral students in clinical psychology. And I actually have a class that it's called Understanding Suicide from Assessment to Intervention and Management. And in that class, not only do I teach my doc students about the problem of suicide historically, epidemiology, theory, history, but then I also teach them how do you actually treat suicidal individuals using the CAMS approach. This is really the byproduct of some political, cultural change in Kentucky. Kentucky is one of 2 states nationally that mandates, it's probably more in the making, but one of 2 states nationally that mandates that behavioral health providers have some additional training as a condition of licensure renewal. And that really kind of opened up the opportunity for me at EKU to then develop this class and to make the argument that we really need to be training clinicians upstream, not downstream when they're out in practice. I also sit on the American Association of Suicidology board. I'm the clinical division director, so I work nationally in suicide prevention. I've worked for a long time in suicide prevention nationally, but this is kind of my biggest role heretofore. And then most recently, I became the co-lead of the Faith Communities Task Force of the National Action Alliance. And I actually serve on that with Greg Hudnall, who's here in Utah, and really am honored to be doing this work, doing all of the work. But I have to tell you, this career path was very much unintentional and involuntary. This was a surprise, a career path, and I'm very much the accidental researcher in the research that I do, because this was not the career path that I had intended. I actually started my career in public health. I was raised by a single parent. My father was a surgeon. He was a surgeon in Eastern Kentucky. And if any of you are the children of physicians, you know that probably if you're like me, you were told every day of your life you were going to be a physician. That was the expectation. And actually when I got to college, I said, you know, Dad, this world is full of amazing things. I may pursue another career path. And so actually I got involved in government, got involved in health policy, and I worked for the director of health in Ohio, writing speeches, doing policy analysis. And I thought my work covered every behavior-related cause of illness and death, but it didn't. But I didn't know it at the time. We covered things like low birth weight babies, like smoking cessation, cancer clusters, obesity, all sorts of behavior-related causes of morbidity and mortality. But it wasn't until Admiral Jeremy Borda died that I was introduced professionally to the problem of suicide. We weren't talking about suicide in Ohio. Now, this happened a long time ago, and I don't know if any of you all remember Admiral Borda's death. It's quite a while ago. He was Chief of Naval Operations for the Navy. He was a remarkable individual. He had dropped out of high school at 16, joined the Navy as an enlisted, and he rose to the ranks of the highest ranking officer in the Navy. But he sat in the naval shipyards on May 16th, 1996, and shot himself in the heart because he was being accused, I think it was Newsweek magazine was accusing him of inappropriately wearing 2 little teeny tiny V for Valor pins, which indicated valor in combat, and they were accusing him of wearing them inappropriately, that he shouldn't be wearing them. And so he shot himself in the naval shipyards. And I have to tell you, this death really rocked the public health service world, it rocked the military, and it rocked public health agencies like the one that I worked for. I remember sitting in my boss's office that morning when we heard about Admiral Borda dying, and we could not even wrap our minds around this. We had no idea how to think about suicide even. I mean, here we were dealing with all these other causes of illness and death, but we had no idea how to even think about suicide. In fact, I remember talking with my boss and saying, should we be preventing suicide? I mean, should we? Is that our job? We had no idea how to talk about this, how to think about it even. So that was my professional introduction. My personal introduction came 13 days later, when my husband Connor died by suicide. Connor was a graduate student at Ohio State University. I was actually planning on, my dad was right, I should have gone to medical school. And I knew that at the time. So I was actually working full-time, going to school full-time. Connor was going to school full-time, finishing up his PhD in chemistry. He was a chemist. He was not an American, he was Irish. He had been recruited by a professor in the Department of Chemistry to come from Ireland. They would recruit top chemistry students from Ireland and other places in Europe to fill spots that Americans couldn't fill. And so he was finishing up his PhD in chemistry, and I was planning on going back to school and hopefully getting into medical school when this happened. And I have to tell you, this was the biggest shock of my life. There were no warning signs, at least that I at the time picked up on. Now looking back, I saw some things, but they were too difficult to really piece together. There's no way I could have prospectively understood that he was thinking about suicide because he never said anything about it. It was a deeply painful event, not just emotionally painful, but physically painful. I felt more physical pain from this loss than anything. He died on a Wednesday, and I was on a plane to Ireland with my uncle and aunt on Saturday. My father had died, actually, when I was in college. So my uncle and aunt kind of stepped up and became my surrogate parents. So they went to Ireland with me to bury him. I didn't think it was fair to bury him in the United States. I felt like it was important to take him back home to Ireland. So we were on a plane on Saturday, buried him on Monday. We were back on a plane in the United States on Tuesday, and I was back at work the following Monday. And when I came back to work, I realized that my life would never be the same again. Not only did I have this devastating experience, but the way people apprehended me, how they saw me, had changed. Previously, I had access to about 1,500 employees at all times. I worked for the CEO of the public health agency in our state. And I could go into people's offices. They were happy to see me. They were friendly. They were happy to give information to me. But when I went back to work, I soon realized that had changed. It was like I was a pariah. It was like I had somehow shared in the taint of what my husband had done. So no one came to my office anymore. It was a very lonely office. I would walk down the hallway, and people would see me coming down the hallway, and they would turn and walk in the opposite direction. The only person who in my office who extended any condolences was actually the assistant director. He, in his very awkward, fumbling way, said, "I'm so sorry about what happened to you." But he couldn't even say the word suicide. My boss, the director of health in Ohio, actually called me into his office and said, "Why didn't you get that speech done for me last week?" And I said, "Well, Dr. So-and-so, I was burying my husband in another country." But there was no acknowledgement of my loss, no condolences. So I knew my life was very, very different. My friends and family didn't want to talk about it. My family absolutely refused to allow me to bring it up at family functions. I remember going to talk to my therapist 2 days after my husband killed himself. And the first thing she said to me was, she had treated me for depression using cognitive behavioral therapy alone because I did not like medications. But she said to me, the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, not Melinda, I'm so sorry, but Melinda, no one promised you a rose garden. No one promised you anything different." And I thought, wow, you can't get outside of your orientation just to express some condolences. I remember going to see my doctor and doing my annual physical. I remember him walking into the exam room, and he said, "Hey, how's that marriage going?" And I said, "Well, he died." And he said, "Well, how did he die?" And I said, "Well, he killed himself." And I will tell you, if my doctor could have run out of that exam room, he would have. He was so uncomfortable. And he said to me, how are you doing? How are you handling that? And I thought to myself, well, I'm handling it a whole lot better than you are right now, So what I experienced was a lot of abandonment and rejection, a lot of feelings of guilt. I felt guilty. I had no explanation for this. I had no warning. He didn't say anything to me about this. I figured I had done something wrong. The newspaper did a small article. I had one of my best friends was an editorial page writer for the Columbus Dispatch, and he actually quelled a much bigger story. Connor died in a very violent way. He was a chemist, so he knew how to kill things, and he died from self-immolation. So it was a very violent public act. And so the newspaper felt led to write a story about this, his death, and then interviewing all of my neighbors to ask them what possibly could have led to this. So I, of course, felt a lot of guilt, a lot of feelings of being blamed, a lot of shame and stigma, professional and personal rejection. It was an unbelievably isolating experience. I was so isolated. And then I also experienced a lot of PTSD symptoms, a lot of sort of more sub-threshold PTSD symptoms. I had flashbacks, I was getting triggered, I thought I saw him places, sort of psychotic symptoms. I couldn't sleep in the bed, I had to sleep on the couch. I was hyper-aroused all the time. I mean, I was a very different person. And I realized later, as I moved on in my career, because what I ended up doing was I got involved. It took a couple of years to kind of heal, to try to understand what had happened to me and what had happened to Connor. Like I said, nobody wanted to talk about it. But the great thing was is that I was working in a public health agency with all these pointy-head epidemiologists, and they didn't mind talking to me about it because they saw the numbers. They crunched the numbers, and they understood it from a very, sort of from a numbers perspective. So they would talk with me about their concerns about the suicide numbers in Ohio. And then I began informing myself and got involved in suicide prevention, and I ended up going back to school and getting a PhD in clinical psychology because while I had made a decision to get involved on the clinical end of medicine, I actually then wanted to be involved in the clinical end of suicide prevention. But later, as I was in my training, I realized that the symptoms and the experiences I was having were also very similar of other individuals who were suicide bereaved. This is a very common experience, some of these things. I want to say, though, that the one place where I felt probably the most peace was going to Mass. Now, the year before my husband died, I entered the Catholic Church. I became a Roman Catholic. And that was a wonderful experience. And I didn't realize at the time how providential it was that I entered the church and really was walking in faith in a very different way, more organized way, more structured way. And I had this wonderful place where I could go and worship. And it was really during Mass where I was able to grieve openly. I was able to find some peace. I cried with Christ on the cross. I suffered with Christ on the cross. That's what I did. But I remember my pastor, the priest of my church, I remember approaching him and saying, this is such a wonderful, this is the one place where I can actually feel some comfort every week. Wouldn't it be great if we had a loss support group in our church for people like me who were really having sort of a crisis in their faith because of a loss experience? Because I was really having a very hard time understanding this experience within the context of my new faith. And I remember my priest saying to me, well, you're the first person that's ever suggested that. As if I had said something wrong to him, as if I was crazy, And so I just kind of shut down and said, okay, maybe that was a really bad idea. And then my father-in-law, Connor's father, knew an Irish priest who was living in the United States. And I thought, well, maybe he would have some answers for me. So I went to talk with him. And I said, Father, I'm really having a hard time understanding this experience within the context of my faith. And instead of answering my question, he said, well, Melinda, I can't give you any ideas about the disposition of Connor's soul. And I thought to myself, I believe in a loving God. I think I know where Connor's soul is. I'm concerned about my soul. And so while church was a wonderful place for me, there weren't a lot of resources for me at the time. So in terms of what faith communities offer, we know that there's scientific evidence that backs up what most of us of faith know, and we know in our hearts. We know that faith communities offer a vibrant and living faith in God. We know that belonging to a community of believers is very important, very helpful. And they also provide us a sense of purpose and hope. They give life meaning in the good times, and they make it bearable in the worst times. Father Ron Rolheiser, I don't know if you all are familiar with him or not. He's kind of a prolific writer, he's a Catholic priest, but he writes a lot about suicide. And he said in a recent book that he wrote, all death unsettles us, but suicide leaves us with a very particular series of emotional, moral, and religious scars. It brings with it an ache, a chaos, a darkness, and a stigma that has to be experienced to be believed. Sometimes we deny it, but it's always there, irrespective of our religious and moral beliefs. I was talking with some reporters outside in the lobby, and they were asking me about what faith communities can do in order to help individuals who might be at risk for suicide or might be suicide bereaved. And I said, actually, clergy, faith community leaders are in a unique position to demonstrate leadership when it comes to attitudes towards individuals who are suicidal and then those who are also suicide bereaved, but also really guiding family members, parishioners, and others to compassionately react to a suicide death, and also to mobilize efforts, mobilize resources for individuals who are struggling. Even down to the vocabulary that we use. Those of us in suicidology typically do not use the word commit suicide anymore. The word commit suicide is thought to not only perpetuate stigma because it suggests a crime like commit a homicide, but it also, so it unfairly stigmatizes the individual who, as most faith communities know, most policy of faith communities assert that individuals who die by suicide are not acting out of free will, but are acting sort of through a fractured lens, not making a decision voluntarily. And so this is an unfair characterization of the behavior of suicide. And so what we do now is we say the words die by suicide or use another word, but we don't use the word commit suicide. So faith leaders are in a perfect position to even demonstrate the right nomenclature. Not just attitudes, not just behavior, but also the right nomenclature. E. Betsy Ross, she wrote a book called Life After Suicide. This is considered like a seminal text kind of early on in the suicide prevention movement. But she writes beautifully about her ambivalence about praying for her husband's soul. But it was her pastor, it was Pastor David that provided comfort to her, encouraged her to pray for David's soul. And he also educated her. He reminded her that the early Christians prayed for the souls of those Christians who were trying to escape the Roman torture and assassination by killing themselves. And he also educated her that the stigma around suicide actually came later. So I think this is a perfect example of a pastor interceding in a very profound way with an individual who was struggling with very basic issues around, should I pray or not for my loved one who died by suicide? Redfield Jamison is a famous bipolar depression researcher. I don't know if y'all are familiar with her or not. She's written a series of books. She's a beautiful writer. She wrote a book called Night Falls Fast. And in Night Falls Fast, she talks about her own bipolar illness, and she also writes about her suicide attempt. And she says, where was God in the midst of this? You know, she brings up the issue, a scientist, a researcher, brings up the issue of where was God in the midst of this? She also writes about the fact that clergy are in a very significant position to really help individuals who are struggling with mental illness, and that there's healing effects that really can come from a caring ministry. Many of you may know that Kay Warren, who also serves with Dr. Greg Hudnall and myself on the Faith Communities Task Force, you may know that she lost her son Matthew to suicide 5 years ago. She's also the co-founder with her husband Rick Warren of the Saddleback Church out in California. I saw her speak recently at the American Association of Suicidality, and she said during that talk, she said, surviving my son's death was barely survivable with my faith. Without it, I can't imagine it being survivable. And I have to tell you, I feel the same way. I don't know. If I did not have my faith, I don't know what I would have done. I don't know that I would have endured it. Kay also, in this beautiful video that was produced, she and Ron Rolheiser and another writer produced this beautiful video last December. It's called Reclaiming Life. And I would encourage you, it's a little pricey, but I would encourage you, perhaps your community, your church, your congregation, to purchase this video and show it to parishioners, because I think this is a beautiful way of demonstrating this intersection of faith and suicide, but also what faith communities can do for individuals who are struggling with suicide, but also those who are suicide bereaved. You know, she talks very candidly about her loss of hope, her loss of faith in a sense. She said, you can't live without hope. I knew that somehow, some way, I was going to have to rebuild hope. My son died by suicide. How could I rebuild hope in the face of losing him in that way? So I think she really hits the nail right on the head. So in my experience of being in church, but not having a lot of people who were there for me or able to talk with me about my experience of suicide loss, there actually were two very memorable men of God that I experienced. And I will have to tell you, I think these two men changed, not only did they demonstrate leadership, but they also changed the trajectory of my grief experience and probably my life. I don't know that I would be here today without these two men. The first one was Father Bill Maroon. Father Maroon was a parish priest at another parish in Columbus, Ohio, and one of my friends had recommended that I go speak with him. And instead of not answering my question or telling me something that was incredibly unhelpful, he sat with me and he cried. We cried together. And he recounted the story of Job and how Job fell into despair like I was falling into despair. And he gave me permission to do it. And he gave me permission also to rail at God. And so it was through biblical scripture that he restoried this experience and allowed me to once again rejoin with God. That was, I'll tell you, in all of the therapy I've had around this experience, pre and post my suicide loss, this was probably the most therapeutic experience I've ever had. And it was one experience, one meeting with Father Bill Maroon. The second one was Father Stephen Hayes. So in the Irish tradition, there is something called the Month's Mind Mass. It's a mass that's held to celebrate the individual's life and their entrance into heaven about a month after the individual dies. And because Connor had friends and colleagues that did not get to go to his funeral in Ireland, I thought it was really important to have a Month's Mind Mass in Columbus, Ohio. So we did. But I have to tell you, I was nervous. I was really nervous because this church is predominated by Dominicans. They're very conservative. They're, kind of very letter of the law. I did not know how his death was going to be handled in this Month's Mind Mass. Father Stephen Hayes, some of the first words he said in this Month's Mind Mass was, "Connor is with God by virtue of his baptism." And I have to tell you, I felt a sigh of relief in that church that day. Not only was I comforted, but I think all of our friends and other family members were comforted by his words. That definitely changed the trajectory of my grief experience. So later on, when I went back to school and was getting my PhD in clinical psychology, I became very interested. I do research. I do suicide research, mainly suicide bereavement research. But I also am very interested in a construct of positive psychology called post-traumatic growth. And I don't know if you all have heard of this idea of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth it's weird. It's in the Bible. It's in all world religions and Greek and Roman literature. But it's only been really captured, conceptualized in the last about 20 years by two psychologists at the University of North Carolina by the name of Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun. They coined the phrase post-traumatic growth, and they also created a measure called the post-traumatic growth inventory. But this work of theirs stands on the shoulders of Viktor Frankl. And I love Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it or not, but I think it's definitely worth a read if you haven't. But I love this idea that even the helpless victim of a hopeless situation, facing a fate he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and by doing so change himself, turn a personal tragedy into a triumph. Now, I'm not going to present data for you all today. I don't want to bore you all to death. But the idea with post-traumatic growth is that there's a 21-item inventory, and there's an overall post-traumatic growth score. And the idea is that the individual who takes this inventory, takes this assessment, has been through a shattering life event, a trauma. Okay? And this has been studied in a broad range of trauma survivors. But the idea is that you have an overall post-traumatic growth score, and then you also have 5 factors or dimensions of post-traumatic growth. The first one is, so you actually have individual scores for these dimensions or factors. The first one is relating to others. Individuals who experience post-traumatic growth typically relate to others differently. I will tell you, my address book changed in the wake of my husband's death. There are friends that I knew years ago that I have yet to hear from in the wake of his death. But there were people in my life that I also became intensely close with. So my uncle and aunt, a very, very different relationship than when we would have had, I think, had this not happened. Very close. Also, new possibilities. There are new venues, new occupations, new avocations that emerge as a result. You begin to volunteer. You get involved, professionally in something different. Also personal strength. It's not that you're bulletproof, but you know that you've probably encountered the worst experience of your life. And if you can make it through that, then you can probably make it through anything. The fourth one is spiritual change. Now, in my case, not only did I become a more spiritual individual, but my walk of faith became much stronger. It doesn't necessarily mean that you become more religious, but you become maybe more spiritual. And then the last one is appreciation for life, being mindful that life is very fragile and that every day is a gift. So I was the first researcher to actually look at post-traumatic growth among the suicide bereaved. And I cultivate this research also in my ongoing, whether it's my Garrett Lee Smith Campus Suicide Prevention Grant, and when I ask college students about their experiences with trauma and substance abuse and suicidality, I also ask them about their post-traumatic growth. I have embedded this in research that I've done with TAPS and also with suicide attempt survivors. So I'm very profoundly interested in the opportunities for growth in the wake of traumas. But I've also become profoundly interested in the intersection of faith and suicide prevention. Another man of God entered my life, and his name was Reverend Dr. Jim Clemens. Jim Clemens was a Wesley Theological emeritus professor. He was a biblical scholar at Wesley Theological Seminary. And while he taught Greek, and he also did very serious research in Greece and Israel and various places, probably his most profound contribution was his involvement in suicide prevention. He was the first person who really raised the issue of the intersection of faith and suicide prevention. He founded the organization called Organization for Attempters and Survivors of Suicide and Interfaith Service, OASIS. Jim also was a mentor of mine. He was a collaborator. I met him when I was getting my PhD, and I was working for an organization called the Suicide Prevention Action Network. We put on a conference that I put on collaboratively with Jim. We became very close. And he really mentored me, but was also my colleague, my friend. Jim also was a profound writer, prolific writer, I should say. He wrote a lot of books about the issue of suicide. Some of them they stand today, although they've been around for a while. They are as relevant today as they were then. One book is called What Does the Bible Say About Suicide? The other is Sermons on Suicide, also Children of Jonah. So he was really one of the first people of faith who really brought up this issue of the importance of faith communities and faith and suicide prevention. He was also very interested in making sure that clergy and seminarians were informed about the new science of suicidology. So suicidology is about 50 years old, but the science of suicidology is actually pretty new. Over the last 20 years, we've learned an awful lot about what makes people suicidal and how to treat suicide. And he was not only interested in educating seminarians and clergy, like me, he wanted to get people upstream, get them while they're in seminary and educate them about the problem of suicide and how to think about suicide more appropriately. But he also wanted to help those ministers, those people who were out in the community who were perhaps conducting sermons and homilies for individuals who had died by suicide. So we conceptualized together this book, The Suicide Funeral. And we started together, but unfortunately, in the midst of this book writing and getting my training, he died. He was killed accidentally. And so I shelved the book for a while. And then several years later, he died in 2011, and then several years later, I actually met a Rabbi Dan Roberts, who was a survivor. His father died by suicide when he was 10. He's also a thanatologist, a leader in the ADEC community, and really a kind of a go-to bereavement person. So he and I actually finished this book together. But this is a compendium of not only template homilies and sermons, but also a collection of information on the sort of the best science, how to think about suicide more clearly and from more of a scientific perspective, but then also what to do in the wake of a suicide. And then also there are topics in here on self-care, clergy self-care. So in addressing this issue of the new science, part of that new science was a new way of understanding how suicide impacts individuals who are exposed to suicide, not just the individual who dies or their immediate family members. Historically, we've thought about suicide as just impact, sort of very categorical. We think about the family, the mother, the father, the siblings. We think about, the children of, but we don't think about those other sort of unknown suicide-exposed and bereaved individuals. But this new science has allowed us to look at this very differently. So now we look at it on a continuum. We've got individuals who are suicide exposed. Those might be people that know the individual who died by suicide, but maybe they don't know them very well. Maybe they knew of them. Maybe they saw them on television. So they're suicide exposed individuals. Then those individuals who are inside of that concentric circle, suicide affected, people who perhaps have a little bit closer relationship. Maybe they work with them, they went to school with them, they go to church with them. Individuals who they're in clubs with, that they know in the community in some way, and they're affected by this death. And then we have suicide bereaved, both short and long term. Those individuals whose lives are profoundly impacted by the loss. So when we think about, and in thinking and in really preparing for today, in reading a lot about the tragedy at Harriman High School, I think about the people who have been profoundly impacted by the loss of these young people at Harriman High School. And so this model, you can really think about the impact of exposure to and those individuals who are affected by suicide by looking at it through the lens of this model. You've got the people who are exposed, so the first responders, the people who may have found the bodies. You think about people who die in hotel rooms, the maids, they're certainly exposed. Family members, the therapists, we oftentimes forget about the therapists. Close friends, they're healthcare workers, they're nurses, they're doctors in their doctor's office. People that they go to school with, people that they work with, acquaintances. Fans of celebrities are also suicide exposed. When Robin Williams died several years ago, I work clinically a lot, and I also do a lot of training of clinicians. And one of the things that I heard in my suicide-focused treatment training was a lot of people in community mental health. I was doing a lot of work in Oklahoma at the time, and clinicians were saying that people were coming into the community mental health agencies wanting to kill themselves, same way that Robin Williams, were very disturbed by Robin Williams' death. They don't even know him, but they are impacted and exposed. You've also got community groups. You've also got rural or close-knit communities, and of course, churches as well. When you think about individuals who are affected, again, we're thinking about people who have a closer relationship with the individual who died. Perhaps classmates, co-workers, team members, neighbors, people you go to church with. And then suicide-bereaved individuals are those who have a sense of sort of greater closeness to the individual who died by suicide. I've worked on some research on suicide exposure and how that impacts individuals. And what we know is those individuals who are suicide exposed have higher levels, and if you look at this, the blue line right here, the blue line are those individuals who are just suicide exposed alone. They have higher levels of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and there was a study done in England a couple of years ago that showed those suicide exposed individuals also had higher rates of suicide attempt. And that was actually a study done among college students, so we're talking about young people, that mere exposure can actually confer pretty serious health consequences. If you think about closeness, this perception of closeness that an individual has to a decedent, it also confers very serious health consequences. We found individuals who felt close to the individual who died by suicide, and this is the purple line, indicated by the purple line, that they had higher levels of depression, PTSD, and prolonged grief. So when we think about exposure to suicide, we're not talking about people who are just sad. We're not talking about people who, there's no reverberations, there's no ripple effect from this death. We're talking about profound impact from suicide exposure alone. Historically, and this was kind of an anomaly of the suicidology world, we talked about there being 6 individuals who were impacted by suicide death. And actually, we found through our research that there are about 135 individuals who are exposed to each suicide death. And about 48 of those individuals felt close or highly close to the individual who died by suicide. And that means there are a lot of people that are probably in need of services themselves that we're not reaching because we're not acknowledging the fact that exposure and being affected actually confers real problems, real health consequences. So what happens when an individual becomes suicidal? What kind of recommendations do I have for you as faith leaders? What can you do to equip yourselves to address the needs of suicidal people? Well, first off, I would encourage you to become familiar with your own experiences with suicide. Secondly, I would encourage you to become informed. Thirdly, know the resources in your community, and Utah has some rich resources. This app, this 3-digit number that's been proffered, these are amazing resources. Also, self-care is really important, and then also becoming engaged. So in my Understanding Suicide class in the doctoral program in clinical psychology, the first assignment I have my students do is actually writing a reflection paper. And it's a reflection paper I only see. Nobody else sees it. But the reflection paper is about what they bring to the table as a clinician in terms of their beliefs and attitudes about suicide. What are the positive and negative effects that might flow from those beliefs and attitudes, with potential remedies for any potential harmful effect? Because we know that we're human beings and we bring a lot to the table. So it's really important to reflect upon those experiences. Now, I will tell you, I tell them, you don't have to disclose to me anything personal, but it's remarkable to me how often I hear about very serious brushes with suicide, whether they've lost somebody to suicide, whether they've had themselves their own suicidal crisis, or whether they themselves have made an attempt and been hospitalized. Typically about half of the class every year, and we have 12 individuals at every new class, half of the class will have some serious experience with suicide. And frequently I will have 1 or 2 that have actually been suicidal, made a suicide attempt, and been hospitalized as a result. So when we're talking about experiences with suicide and with something that could definitely, if not explored and reflected upon, could definitely impact their ability as a clinician to effectively treat individuals. But I also bring up another idea. Henry Nouwen wrote this beautiful book called The Wounded Healer. And in The Wounded Healer, he says, in our own woundedness, we become a source of life to others. So a reporter out in the lobby asked me about thinking about suicide as a weakness. So one of the things I tell my students is, your experience of being wounded actually can be a strength for you as a therapist. You know what it's like to to be in their shoes, to have their experience, and that actually gives you a leg up. So I would encourage those of you in the audience who are wounded healers to not think of your experiences with suicide, whether suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, or your own experiences in your own communities with suicide loss as weaknesses or vulnerabilities. I would encourage you to think of them actually as strengths. Secondly, I really would encourage you to become informed. Perhaps the best mainstream book out there is called Why People Die by Suicide by Thomas Joyner. Thomas Joyner is a very well-known researcher, but he also wrote probably the best, like I said, the best mainstream book on how to understand suicide. Now, this is not done in scientific vernacular. It's done in mainstream layman's language, and it's a beautiful book, rich information, and will really help you understand his theory. He's got a theory called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And this is actually the latest thinking around suicide. We've had various sort of prevailing theories over the last decade or two, or last as a century or two. But his is the latest and prevailing theory in the field. Also, another book that came out this last year called Helping the Suicidal Person, Tips and Techniques for Professionals by Stacey Friedenthal is also another book I would encourage you to purchase if you can. It's geared toward professionals, but I think it's perfect for anybody who's working in a community, any professional working in a community. It really gives you bite-sized nuggets, how to understand suicide, how to talk to people who are suicidal, and then also how to think about treatment for suicide. So I think it's also really perfect. There also are some faith-based resources. This Reclaiming Life video, which I just love, and I would encourage every faith community leader to get a copy of it, and also Ron Rolheiser's new book, Bruised and Wounded, all about the experiences of struggling to understand suicide, particularly as a faith leader. No resources. As I said earlier, you all have some profound and rich resources here in Utah. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I don't know if everybody knows that number. I hope you do. You all have the app, and I think you're soon going to have a three-digit number here in Utah, but the Suicide Prevention Lifeline helps millions of people every year nationally when they're in a suicidal crisis. It's a 24/7 confidential toll-free number. There's also a crisis text line. I think we have to be certain that we're talking to people in a language that they understand, and certainly young people, texting is a way in which they communicate. Crisis text line is a profound resource for individuals who may not be able to make a phone call but can definitely text and ask for help. Also, knowing mental health professionals in your community who are competent to work with suicidal individuals or the suicide bereaved. Just because you have a PhD or an LCSW does not mean that you, or an MD, does not mean that you are competent to talk to suicidal people or competent to work with the suicide bereaved. I would encourage you to find professionals in your community that you've vetted, who have been trained. And if you don't have anybody in your community who's been trained, I would encourage you to get them trained. So have them attend a CAMS workshop, have them attend a DBT training, or get trained in cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention. Also knowing those resources in your community for suicide bereaved, such as survivors of suicide groups, suicide bereavement groups. And then lastly, cultivating resources for consultation. Knowing the people on the state level who are suicide prevention leaders. Loss teams. I don't know if you've heard of the loss team concept or not. It's the local outreach to suicide support. Some states, they will have community coalitions that have these teams of people that are dispatched on the site of a suicide. They actually work with the coroner and work with the police to go and help. And it's not that they're providing therapy or anything, but they're just there to give the family information about the local survivor of suicide group or local information that might be helpful for them down the road. Also cultivating mental health professionals and medical professionals in your community that you can call and talk with them when you're concerned about a parishioner or somebody in your community. Fourth, self-care. Self-care is so important. I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we don't think that faith community leaders and clergy are not at risk for suicide. Actually, I know of several suicides among clergy in the Lexington, Kentucky community for the last couple of years, and the reason I know is because I've treated their parishioners who have been devastated by these losses. I also have a priest friend who told me that in his career, 3 priests that he knew had died by suicide. So I think if we think that clergy are somehow immune, they're not immune. It's very important to engage in self-care. The American Association of Suicidality has wonderful resources on their website. I would encourage you to look at the Clinician Survivor Task Force, also the Lost Survivor resources. We also have a directory of SOS groups nationally. That's also a wonderful resource. I have been hoping to have a clergy survivor task force, which contains, much like the Clinician Survivor Task Force, a listserv that anybody can join. You have to be a clergy member. You have to have had an experience with suicide to kind of need access to this listserv. But this is a wonderful community. And as a board member of AAS, I'd really like to make this happen during my tenure. And perhaps this is something that can get started in Utah. So perhaps there are clergy who are really interested in being moderators for a listserv, for a national listserv for clergy survivors. I would also encourage therapy or counseling, spiritual direction. When I worked in the Lexington VA mental health clinic, I saw a Baptist minister every month. And the reason he said he would come in to see me for therapy every month is he said his peer group leaked like a sieve. And he needed a confidential person for support that he could come talk to every month. And so that's what I did. Become engaged. Join AAS. Join AFSP. Join advocacy efforts statewide. Let me tell you something. As a clergy leader, state legislators will listen to you. Federal legislators will listen to you because they know that you're important people in the community. So you have a profound voice among policymakers. Become a gatekeeper trainer. I was so impressed that your lieutenant governor is QPR trained. That is amazing. I am so profoundly moved by what he is doing here in Utah. But you yourself should also become gatekeeper trained. So engaging QPR or assist. One of the things, though, that I think that we could both, those of us in mental health and also in faith communities, could do a better job of, is this challenge of empathy. This is a real challenge. So those of us in mental health and those of you who are in faith communities as leaders do not want to in any way endorse suicide as a way of coping or a way of solving problems, right? We don't want to endorse it. However, if we tell people, don't do that, what kind of dynamic is created? Especially if that individual, and we're going to assume that they're in a lot of psychological pain. What I tell my students is, we do not want to endorse the behavior, but what we want to do is empathize with the suicidal wish. We say to them directly, I understand why you'd want to die. I understand what would lead up to your wanting to die. So you empathize with the thoughts of suicide, but you don't endorse the behavior. I think there are 3 really important questions that we all, as mental health professionals, as faith community leaders, can ask. And these came out of the work of Edwin Schneidman. Edwin Schneidman was the founder of Suicidality. He also founded the American Association of Suicidology. But he has 3 questions that I think convey this empathy perfectly. The first one is, how big is your pain? The second one is, where does it hurt? And the third one is, how can I help you? And I think as faith leaders, you can ask these questions as well. I train my doctoral students when we're talking about, because we do a lot of role-playing in this class, and we do a lot of practicing, asking each other, are you having thoughts of suicide, and becoming comfortable. And also asking questions in a non-judgmental way, in a way that's going to elicit valid responses. And one of the things I train them to do is to not ask the question, you're not having thoughts of suicide, are you? Because what is that going to elicit? It's going to shut the person down, and they're not going to tell you the truth, right? So it's really important that you ask these questions, you convey your empathy, and you ask them in a non-judgmental way. But you do it with empathy. It's not endorsing the behavior. Okay, so tangibly, what can faith leaders do? The National Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force is part of the overall efforts of the National Action Alliance. We're part of many task forces that are attempting to enact the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, which is the blueprint for suicide prevention in the United States. Our goal is to champion suicide prevention as a national priority, catalyze efforts to implement high-priority objectives from the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention, and also to cultivate resources needed to sustain progress. So I told you earlier about Thomas Joyner's interpersonal theory of suicide. So according to this interpersonal theory of suicide, and this is relevant to faith leaders, I'll tell you in just a second, it's relevant because his theory states there are 3 things that make suicide possible. One, the first idea is that an individual does not feel like they are part of a community they once felt they were part of. We call that thwarted belongingness, or no longer feeling like you're a part, you're alone. The second one is this sense of being a burden. It's that I'm a problem, I'm a burden. And according to Joyner's theory, when those 2 come together, that's where suicidal ideation comes. People start thinking about suicide. The third idea that's really profound is this thing we call capability for suicide, or acquired ability to enact lethal self-harm. It's kind of a fearlessness in the face of death. It's this not fearing death, not being scared of holding a gun, not being scared of shooting a gun, not being scared of turning a gun on yourself or doing some other not irreversible, very lethal means. Oops, somehow we got forwarded. So when these 3 things come together, according to Joyner, that's where suicide occurs. When we think about faith communities, what do faith communities provide, and what are the protective factors that are brought about by faith communities? Well, they promote hope, they build healthy social connections, they provide answers to life's challenging questions, they recognize and celebrate the myriad reasons for living and the God-given value of each member in the community, no matter how young, old, infirmed, weak, strong, healthy. And they also support those who face mental health challenges that might place them at risk for suicide, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's homelessness, whether it's trauma. And they provide resources and support the families and loved ones as well. So when we think about what places an individual at risk for suicide, faith communities are already doing those things that address the issue of what places an individual at risk for suicide. We're already doing it. So the National Action Alliance's Faith Communities Task Force is asking faith communities to engage in 3 ways. There are 3 sort of levels of engagement. The first one is to crawl. Do what you do already, but do it better. So praying for individuals who are suicidal or those who are suicide bereaved. Facilitating social connections. Worshiping and teaching. Disseminating helpful information, perhaps having flyers. And then also dispatching pastoral care to those who are hurting. Level 2 is what we call the walk level. That's going to the next level. That's promoting psychological and spiritual resiliency, having classes, speakers, peer support groups. You might have a Celebrate Recovery group. You might have a Survivors of Suicide group. There's also something called Suicide Anonymous, which is for individuals who are suicidal. Also supporting effective treatment. Learning to distinguish between a mental illness and a spiritual crisis. Establishing referral sources in the community. That's where the kind of vetting people who are competent to treat suicidal people or suicide bereaved comes in. Also sponsoring behavioral health trainings. The third level is to go all in. That's to train leaders and members in these gatekeeper trainings like QPR, like ASSIST, and other like mental health first aid, other gatekeeper trainings, also to establish a full-blown mental health ministry. And then additionally to engage in greater community transformation, such as clergy groups and then also community coalitions. The Faith, Hope, Life campaign is a very specific campaign. This is part of this, what do you all do already naturally in your community? Well, you pray. And so last year we had our first ever National Day of Prayer. And on the faithhopelife.org website, we have all sorts of great resources for you. In fact, out on the NAMI table is this wonderful resource that's actually we created for this year called the National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, Life Prayer Guide. So we've actually created a prayer guide. You don't have to create your own prayers. We actually have created some template prayers for you that you can use. So we have lots of other resources such as worship and spiritual resources. We have communication aids. We have resources for mental health promotion and suicide prevention in faith communities. As I said, last year we had our National Day of Prayer, which was just one day, which was Sunday, September 10th. September 10th every year happens to be World Suicide Prevention Day. So we picked that day as the National Day of Prayer. This is actually the bulletin. This is sitting in my lap in my church in Lexington. I was so blown away. My bishop didn't bother to tell me that they were actually going to do this on Sunday, September 10th. I got to church and I saw the bulletin. I thought, wow, this is amazing. So we participated in the National Day of Prayer. This year, though, we're doing the National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, Life. And the idea is we're wanting to join the broad range of faith communities that may not worship just on Sunday. They may worship on Friday or worship on Saturday. And we have a new website. We have new resources. So I encourage you to reach out, to watch the video, to also pledge, and to also promote this National Weekend of Prayer. And here are the websites for the Faith, Hope, Life campaign. You can also join us on Facebook. We have a great Facebook page. I would encourage you to join us on Facebook. And then also the National Weekend of Prayer website. I thank you very much for your time and attention. I appreciate being here today. This is such an honor. And I'm wondering if there are any questions at all in the audience.
When those are grouped geographically together and we get this contagion effect, what do you know about that? How many? How do we get? What's the tipping point for that to bubble over?
So I think this perception of closeness is really important. So people who are suicide exposed, certainly in some cases, there are, like I told you about the fans of Robin Williams, definitely we're coming into mental health, I know in Oklahoma, and talking about wanting to kill themselves in the same way. But those also may be individuals who were kind of lifelong fans of Robin Williams. They felt close to him. Not just people like me who liked Morgan Mindy, but I didn't feel particularly close to him. I was impacted by his death, very sad about it. It was a tragedy. But those people who were real fans, they felt close to him. I think it's that perception of closeness. We have to look at the network around the individual. So I think, we typically look, like I said, at kin relations. But I think we have to look at their best friends, at the social clubs they belong to, the teams that they're on. We have to look at their entire network. So when there's been a death, we have to look at the entire network around that individual. But also doing screening, having competent people to ask the right questions. I think this is why gatekeeper training is so important. But then also, we can have all the 1-800 numbers in the world, but unless you have competent professionals to refer to who know how to treat suicide, you're not going to change anything. So I think it's a multifaceted problem, and there's a multifaceted answer to it. Yes, ma'am.
As we had a cluster at our high school, at Lone Peak High School, and in our community as faith leaders, we had brought in Dr. Hudnall, which was wonderful. In creating conversations, everyone's polarized. I'm just from our experience, and we haven't refined this. I'm asking for your help and maybe helping us understand better how to do this. But everyone's polarized and worried about contagion, and so then they don't talk at all. And being able to learn how to give them words of how to have these conversations, what we do talk about, that we don't talk about necessarily how it happened, but it's okay to talk about it. And putting words in their mouth and giving them dialogue actually has opened up a lot of opportunity for us. We have reduced suicide, fortunately. We hope that continues, but we've had more that we're aware of that are on watch care. And that our faith leaders and our bishops have felt that training has helped them be able to uncover these individuals in the conversations. Parents have had conversations that have helped them find other children that are friends of their children by talking with their children. But that's been a big important thing of being able, so maybe you could perhaps share with us what not to say, because people are not, they're afraid to say anything at all, and what is appropriate.
Well, I mean, I think just, not keeping the secret, right? Do you have, when it's a school environment, not having an auditorium. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not an expert when it comes to school-based suicide prevention, but I've done a couple of post-ventions in schools, and I know talking in small groups, giving them permission to talk about their feelings, and how it impacts them, and then making sure you have professional help to refer them to after that. But I think it's all about giving them permission like you did, and making sure that you don't shut them down or say things like, "You're not thinking about suicide, are you?" That kind of thing. I mean, it's just kind of basic communication skills, I think, when it comes to that environment. I don't know if that helps or not, but I'm happy to talk with you offline about this as well. Yeah.